Good afternoon, everybody. Today we have Professor Abarbanel from the University of California, San Diego. It's a pleasure for me to say some words about him, although it's very difficult to summarize the very large activity he has had for many years, mainly in the field of nonlinear dynamics. He's currently spending a sabbatical stay in the UK, so we have the chance to invite him for at least one day being here and to have a talk from him. Henry has a Bachelor in Physics from Caltech and PhD in Physics from Princeton. He has served on faculties of Princeton, Stanford, Northwestern University, University of Chicago, Berkeley, University of California, Santa Cruz, and since 1982 he's at the University of California, San Diego as professor in physics. Currently he has appointment at the Fermi National Accelerator Lab. He's researcher at the Marine Physics Lab Institution of Oceanography. He's research director at the Institute of Global Conflicts and Cooperation at the University of California and director of the Institute for Nonlinear Science at the University of California, San Diego. Since 1974, he has been a member of JSON, which is a consulting group to the U.S. government on technical matters. In 1992, he became a member of the City Council of Del Mar in California, where he served as a mayor in 1995 and 1996. In that role, he has served on numerous regional bodies concerning energy, wastewater, infrastructure, and quality of life in the San Diego area. He is a member of the San Diego Regional Water Quality Control Board by appointment of the Governor Jerry Brown. He has about 200 publications in Journal of Science Citation Index with roughly 10,000 citations. He has many famous papers, but one of them that many of us know, which is related to the synchronization of unidirectionally coupled chaotic systems that he published in 1995 in Physical Review and received more than 1,000 citations. He is currently leading, for the fourth time, a multidisciplinary research initiative, this time related to the dynamic principle of collective brain activity. The initiative is funded by the U.S. Department of Defense for 5 years with a budget of $7 million. He has been active in field ranging from elementary particle physics to nonlinear dynamics of biological and physical systems in general. His main topics right now are related to mechanism of synaptic plasticity in the brain, bird song dynamics, information process in neural assemblies, and communication with peers. So, Henry, thank you very much for being with us. You can do it.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I noticed that you have posters around all the things that you do. It's extremely impressive. For me, the most difficult one is the one in this corner, the social phenomena. And I explained earlier that I wanted to give a talk on hard science and easy science. Easy science is physics. You can imagine what hard science is. And I think it's an incredible challenge and very difficult, and we'll be at it for some time. Lots of opportunities there for people who are trained in physics. I'm going to talk about something today that touches on many of the topics that are on these posters. And I came to consider this topic because I began work with somebody you know named Robert Niblin, who's at the University of Buenos Aires 7 years ago, on the dynamics of birdsong. And I continued that work with him and with a colleague at the University of Chicago. Birdsong was chosen because it's a neural system that is a functional neural system with only about 1 million neurons. When a physicist here says something has 1 billion neurons, she walks out the door and goes to work on something else. If a neuroscientist here that something is interesting with 1 billion neurons, they stay for 30 years. So I don't know whether we'll be at it 30 years from now, but for various reasons, I hope so. The problem that was immediately interesting for the physicists was that even in a neural circuit, which is as small as your hand, but that's as big as birds, brain and alien brain is smaller. If you would like to understand the function and connectivity of those million neurons, you'd think you'd have to do a lot of very careful experiments measuring in order to understand how they're connected, measuring individual behavior of a lot of those neurons over some time, over many hundreds of cycles, tens of seconds for each of those systems. Unfortunately, the number of neurons that you can measure in those circuits on a really good day is 2. But on most days it's 1. So I asked myself if we had examples in physics where we had very complicated problems that were important both from a physics point of view and a social point of view, where we had a lot of degrees of freedom, but we couldn't make very many measurements. Could we collect together a set of problems in which the measurements were sparse, the number of degrees of freedom was large, and the problem was very interesting? There are many such problems. One that I'm especially interested in is weather prediction, numerical weather prediction as core of understanding the atmosphere ocean system. At the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, which Spain belongs to, it has since 1970, the number of degrees of freedom in the models that they use for predicting weather in Europe alone is 5 times 10 to the 9. So the physicist who left the room at 10 to the 6th, she's now on the 3rd floor. That's far away. There is no way that I can think of that we can afford to or even carry out 5 times 10 to the 9 measurements. And why would we want to do that? In order to use the dynamical equations, which are, after all, the equations of fluid dynamics plus information about the boundary layers. Where are the mountains? What does the ocean look like? Where are the trees? What is the biosphere? Where is the ice? As well as the properties of the atmosphere stretching up the troposphere. We couldn't afford to do 5 times 10 to the 9 measurements. We've done a lot better with satellites, but putting satellites into orbit and measuring properties of the column of the atmosphere and the surface of the ocean, still, even at the cost of 500 million euros per satellite, doesn't get us the measurements. So I'm going to describe how physicists came to look at this problem. Turns out that we can classify it by the blue panel over there. These panels were nicely chosen. Thank you for inviting me to this room. It turns out to be a problem in statistical physics. It's a problem that we've faced in the past, both on the quantum level and at a certain abstraction on the classical level. Interestingly enough, much more than quantum level. You'll recognize some of the words that I use if you listen carefully about collapse, probability distributions. It's not exactly the same as quantum physics. Very simple. And even more important from my point of view, in studying how one would analyze these systems, we found that if you have a limited number of measurements, you still may not be able to establish parameters of your model of the system, your model of the atmosphere. You'd like to predict what will happen 6 hours from now, 24 hours from now. In order to do that, you must know all of the parameters in the model. Those are typically transport coefficients, transport of heat, transport of viscosity, transport of heat, transport of momentum, transport of properties. And you have to know the state of the atmosphere, 5 times 10 to the 9 initial conditions, integrate the equations. How many do you really need to know? And the answer is, it's typically smaller than the number of degrees of freedom. But it's not limited by what you might expect. It's limited by the intrinsic instabilities of the nonlinear system that you're dealing with, not the number of satellites. It may be large enough that you can't afford the satellites, but you can actually determine by studying the systems using numerical simulation. I call them twin experiments, which is a name I stole from geophysicists. Twin experiment means you have a model, you'd like to know the properties of the model. You'd like to use your technique for determining on the basis of knowledge of some of the variables of the model. So, for example, in the meteorological case, You'd like to have the height of the ocean everywhere on the Earth, and you'd like to have the temperature at 10 kilometers and whatever else you can measure. You generate the data, you have the model, you know all the parameters, you ask, what information do I need to estimate the parameters and to estimate the state variables of the system that I don't know? If I could do that, I'd be in good shape, because then as a physicist, I'm ready to go with the initial value problem, and I do my calculation. Turns out not quite that simple. Part of the problem, as I will explain, is the measurements you make are noisy. Like, reduce the noise where you can. The model that you make has errors. No doubt in the world that you'll have them forever. And the state of the atmosphere when you start making measurements of it is probably unknown to you. So the problem is a statistical physics problem. You can't calculate the weather. You can calculate the expected weather and the RMS variation around the expected weather by knowing the probability distribution of these 5 times 10 to the 9 states. So what I'm going to talk about is known in meteorology more or less as statistical data assimilation. Statistical is clear. Look at that panel. Okay. Data is clear, you're measuring data. And the assimilation is a cute term for geophysicists, which says you're going to take information from the data, use it to determine the properties of the model, and make the best prediction of the probability distribution that I possibly can. That will turn out to be a path integral, which is very familiar both from statistical physics and quantum mechanics. That was more or less unknown until I cranked up my attempt to understand nervous systems by trying to understand the answer. So if you think that I'm just a confused physicist, I have a sense that I'm in the right room. And I hope that you will find that some of the things that I say are helpful in your own work. And I hope you'll ask, I don't know your custom here, but I hope you'll ask questions as they occur, as well as at the end. You don't have to say. Okay, so we need to. I'm both in physics and at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Scripps has been part of the University of California since 1903. They're beginning to recognize that, but the rest of us recognize it intrinsically and very, very. So I'm going to repeat some of the things that I said as an introduction. I'm interested in general and complex study systems where you cannot measure all of the variables of the system. Giving you the example, I'd like you to let 5 times 10 to the 9th degrees of freedom seep into your brain for a while and ask how many measurements you can make. The answer is typically a few times 10 to the 7th, maybe 10 to the 8th. You recognize that as a number, which is still a lot smaller than 5 times 10. Okay, so I'm going to address a number of questions. I will try to point them out when I think I've answered them, but keep this in mind. I want to look at how many measurements do in fact I have to make. I will show you why that's a limiting factor, and it doesn't have to be the number of degrees of freedom, but typically it can't be 1. Okay? Which states should you observe? I'm going to show you that from the statistical physics point of view, when you make a measurement, you are literally, in the sense of Shannon's information theory from the 1940s, transferring information from that measurement to the state, to its parameters and state variables, and not all measurements are equal. How often should we make these observations? Every time I have to make a certain number of measurements. If I make those measurements with big time interval between, because these systems are chaotic or can be chaotic, I will lose completely my knowledge of the system after the first measurement by the time I get to the second measurement. And that's a standard property of chaos in nonlinear systems that I think you're familiar with. What's less familiar is that at each time of measurement, you have to make more than one measurement. All right. How do we use the estimates to what I call complete the model? Estimate all the parameters, estimate all the unobserved state variables, and then predict. So prediction is the metric, not whether or not you get a good fit to the data. Getting a good fit to the data turns out to be pretty easy. Predicting it turns out to be really hard. Okay, and let me I'm going to use examples from. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to use examples from neurobiology. If you aren't intimately familiar with the Huxley equations of neurobiology, think of them as current conservation plus voltage-dependent resistors. Okay. I think I'll write down the equations and you can have a look at that. I'm going to use an equation from geophysics, which I call physicist atmosphere. It was introduced by Adam Grant, who's known for his equations in 1963. He has a lot of these examples. This is one from 1926. For him, the equation of motion of the atmosphere is a bunch of stations on a ring, which you can think of as the equator. There's no ocean, there's no land, there's no atmosphere, there's no mountains. So it's physicists. But it's a very useful tool, widely used in geophysics because a lot of things are understood about it and it has properties that we don't. I've said this, so we agree that what we're interested in is if we look at the system we're observing from time 0 to time capital T, we would like to know the probability distribution at time capital T given all the observations that we made during this period. If we knew this, we could calculate the expected value of the state of the system. We could calculate the RMS errors, and we could project forward with our equations of motion and our knowledge if the system is chaotic, how long into the future we might get the projection given the RMS errors in this estimation. To establish some notation, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to think of this as a problem in communications. I'm making measurements that I'm going to call Y, and I'm making capital L. After I've made the measurements, I know the system that the measurements were made on. If it happened to be a collection of neurons in the songbird brain, I'm not interested in time scales of nanoseconds, and I'm not interested in length scales of kilometers. And so I think about a model, and I make a model of the dynamical system. I call that X for the states of the system. And since everything is in fact solved in incremental time, I'm going to talk about the map from a system at time n to a system at time n plus 1. And this will have d variables. D is typically much, much bigger than L. I think of this as a transmitter in which I am transmitting the result of my measurements, and I want the results of those measurements to somehow match at my receiver some function of the state of the system. If the output of the model is tuned, and the model is tuned correctly, the way you would tune a receiver to receive a radio broadcast, for example, if this is tuned correctly, then the output of this model, some function of the output of the model will match what I measured. This I call synchronization. When this occurs, the data and the model output are synchronized, and this blue line, which is a manifold space inside the bigger space of d plus n dimensions, we call the synchronization manifold. If that's stable, then during the time that I'm adjusting the states and the parameters here to tune the receiver, this has given me a nice smooth surface. It turns out that this communication channel is not stable in general. It requires many measurements to stabilize it. Determining the number of measurements that permit the synchronization and permit the search for states and parameters is a critical number. In the case of geophysical problems, as simple as the equations of motion of a thin fluid on a flat plate, which are the basic equations that go into the more complicated physics of a thin fluid, the ocean or atmosphere of the sphere, you need about 70% of the variables of the system to be measured in order to stabilize that. So I will talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about it in the neurobiology context. At the end of the talk, I'll show you our ideas for getting around what would appear to be a very difficult problem of not having enough measurements. Okay. Here are the neurobiological examples. I'm just going to show you a picture and then come back to what we did with it so you have an idea of what the challenge is. When I say we, I'm being royal here, I'm not individual. I do not cut the heads off the birds to be able to extract their brains. Some of my friends do. You take a section of the avian brain that's connected with the generation and learning of birdsong. You take a slice of that piece of the brain and you put electrodes into that slice. You put currents into the electrodes. I'll show you an example of that. You measure the voltage response. Why are we doing that? Because our view is that we want to understand the dynamics of the network of neurons not as a guess from the top down, but as a construction using the biophysical properties of the elements of the network, which are the neurons and the connections through synapses and other less common connections. So our view is that we'll study the individual neurons, and then we'll study networks. The approach that we're going to use is going to be approximately the same from the point of view of the general physics problem. I'm going to show you what progress we've made on studying individual neurons. That in itself is we select the injected current, we measure the membrane voltage. Selecting the injected current, which you can see in the next picture, is done in the following way. This is the current that we selected as a function of time. Those of you who are at all familiar with biological experiments will see that this is not a sequence of step functions, although there are a few step functions here. These currents should be large enough in amplitude, both positive and negative, to stimulate all of the active degrees of freedom in any model that you make of it. It should be long enough in time to stimulate all of the very slow dynamics of the neuron, which, if you're familiar with it, include calcium dynamics inside these cells. That's very important. And it should be low enough frequency in the sense of a Fourier transform of this signal, because the neuron, which consists of a bilipid layer that keeps the outside from the inside, acts as a capacitor. There are resistive elements. There's an RC time constant for this little nonlinear device, and it acts as a low-pass filter. You put all of your information into high frequencies, none of it gets into them. We designed 50 current cycles. I'm going to show you a few of them. And for each neuron that we could remove from the brain, isolate, and put in an electrode into, we held for 2 or 3 hours. We then presented currents like this. I'll show you some others. 50 different times, measured the voltage response, and we took 1,500 milliseconds, 1,500 milliseconds of these data, and estimated the parameters in a complicated model that involved currents of sodium and potassium and calcium and other things. And then we predicted. And I'm going to show you later the results of that prediction. First, I'm going to talk about that. I want to motivate to you the fact that I'm going to get a path interval as the final answer, that I'm going to derive it for you, because it turns out that information plays a major role as basically the forcing that allows you to transfer the information down this communications channel from your measurements. Think about it this way. Time is going here. The label. I'm going to measure in an interval between t0 and t little m, which is the end of the measurement period. I'm going to start measuring here. I'm going to make a measurement here, a measurement here, a measurement here. What's happening during the times when there's no measurement? I have to take the system, which I only know here is a probability distribution for the states of the system, and move it forward in time until I make a measurement. Propagating a probability distribution forward in time means solving Fokker-Planck or a master equation, depending on the properties of the noise in the system. And now I have to tell you how to modify the probability distribution associated with the measurement. And then I have to propagate it. Next step, make the next measurement, and so forth until I'm at the end. If I made no measurements whatsoever, you would say, oh, probability distribution satisfies, or excuse me, its solution, its interval representation is a path interval. We know that to be true in quantum mechanics, where we talk about complex probability amplitudes, and it's also true in classical physics, where we talk about probability amplitudes, right? So it's a path interval before you make any measurements. The only thing that changes is that every time you make a measurement, you have to give a rule that tells you how you modify your probability distribution to reflect the measurement you make. In a complex chaotic system, since the distribution of your initial conditions is, well, you know, probability distribution of initial conditions, a group of initial conditions spreads out over the attractor and can be essentially anywhere on the attractor, but when you make a measurement, it says, no, we're over here. And that modifies the probability distribution, the measure on the attractor, like, to say, oh, it should be concentrated over here. And then you let it propagate a little bit more, you make another measurement. And pretty soon what you've done is tracked where the system went. The knowledge of that tells you what the parameters and the initial conditions for the system should have been, and that enables you to determine the properties of the system and then predict. So that's the motivation for the probability distribution. Here's the arithmetic of the probability distribution. Okay? The notation is I want the probability distribution at the end of measurements, given the set of the set of measurements that I make between time 0, time 1, time 2, time m minus 1, time n. I want the conditional probability. I want the distribution conditioned on the measurements. Because as I said, if you make no measurements, the system marches off on the attractor. If you make measurements, it says you must be here at this time, you must be here at this time, you must be there. So it's interesting to ask, what is the advantage of making a measurement? Why bother? So here's a little example. My measurement interval is 2. It's 3 steps long, 0, 1, and 2. And I would like to know, if I make 3 measurements at time 0, time 1, and time 2, how much information do I have, or have I gained, by making the last measurement? If I gain 0 information, why bother? Don't need the measurement. All right, if you use the definition of conditional probability, sometimes known as Bayes' rule, sometimes known as Bayes' theorem. My theorem is that 3 over 2 equals 6 over 4. It's an identity. So you don't learn anything from that, you learn something from interpreting it. If you use Bayes' rule, or the definition of conditional probability, the probability distribution at time 2, having made 3 measurements, is related to the probability distribution at time 2, having made 2 measurements, by this quantity, whose logarithm, according to Shannon, is exactly the mutual information between the new measurement you made and the state of the system that you want to know at time 2, and the information you had before. This is known as the conditional mutual information, and it is precisely the quantity that Shannon determines, or is defined, to measure the amount of information in a communication. Who would care about this? Well, I think I've written it out a little bit more here. So it says, now if you take logarithm to base 2, the information you have after the measurement in bits is the new information plus the information before. This tells you how important that measurement was. If you're a meteorologist and you're begging the European Space Agency to put up a satellite so that you have 10 to the 7th new measurements, they can now come to you and say, how many bits of information do I learn about the equations of motion of the atmosphere? And you will do the calculation, you come back and you say 4. And they say, how many bits do I need to know to improve the predictability of the atmosphere using the equations of motion? If your answer is 12, you're not going to put the satellite up. If your answer is 2, they probably won't put the satellite up. But if your answer is 0.5 is all you need to know and you're going to get 4, they might consider it. This actually has some really practical implications at 500 million neurons a second. it's much cheaper to do neuroscience experiments if you don't have distribution. Okay. I want to skip ahead a little bit. Once you now got the picture that you can ask, how do I move the probability distribution forward in time, and how do I modify the probability distribution when I make a measurement? There's a fundamental recursion relation that we can define, which is based upon two things. One is exactly the property I used before, which is the property of conditional probability distributions. These are identities. And the other is the Markov property, which for physicists derives from the fact that underlying what you're doing is a differential equation. And therefore the state now completely determines the state of the next one. And if it doesn't, because you secretly have time delays or something in there, you expand your state space, you can make it independent. Every Markov property, which to me is a fancy way of saying the equations that we deal with in physics, has the property that the probability distribution for at time m, having made m minus 1 measurements, is related to the probability distribution a time earlier, the same number of measurements, with a kernel, which is the transition probability of going from state at time m minus 1 to state at time m. This is exactly what it is in quantum mechanics, where we usually call this the kernel. It's e to the minus action over h bar. This happens to be a real quantity. It's not complex, and it happens to be a little bit different in classical physics, but it's exactly the same kind of thing. This says, if you know the probability distribution earlier, you can move that forward in time. These are the equations. Once you have that, you can have a recursion relation that tells you the probability distribution at the end of the measurements, given all of the measurements, is related by the mutual information factor and a propagation of the information one step from the probability distribution one step earlier with one pure measure. This recursion relation, if you, yes sir?
Excuse me, your assumption of Markov's property would depend on the number of variables.
Absolutely. If you have too few, you project it down to a lower dimensional space and you've lost the Markov property.
How do you handle that?
You look at the equations of motion. If there's a time delay, you know you have to add them. In principle, you have to add an infinite number, you make a partial differential equation. Otherwise, you look at it and ordinary differential equations satisfy that automatically. I don't think that generally in physics problems is a big problem. Okay. If you now take this recursion relation and iterate it across your observations, you get this. Probability distribution at the end of measurements, given all of the measurements, is given by the integral over all of the state variables at all of the times that you've made a measurement. That's the path through state space. With a weighting function, which consists of two terms. It's the sum of terms about information transfer plus the sum of terms about propagation of the state from time to time. Here's a little bit here. This is absolutely analogous to the action in quantum mechanics. There's no I over h bar. Everything is real here. There's no h bar. This is the information transfer term, and this is the propagation term. If you like to think about this as the kinetic energy and the potential energy, this being the propagation without any measurements whatsoever, this term acts as a potential that draws your probability distribution over to the right place according to your measurements. So it gives a role to information transfer, which I think everybody in the room, everybody associated with every one of these posters will agree is a critical feature of complex systems. I was pretty pleased when I first saw this, because I didn't anticipate this. It also means that if you have a function on the path, such as the orbit, or such as the components of the orbit squared so you can calculate the RMS error along the path, or any function you want, you have to do an integral. The integral is e to the minus action times the function divided by what you need to normalize it. And that's something that physicists are quite familiar with. That means in order to answer the kinds of questions about how do I take information from measurements, provide them to a model, which I can then use for predictions, boils down to doing a statistical physics problem that we have a lot of familiarity with, and we know a lot about programs. I want to go back one step. I know effectively two ways to do this. One is to use Laplace's methods from 1774 to do a stationary phase approximation to this, which looks for zeros in the derivative of the action, namely the stationary location. In quantum field theory and statistical physics, we call that perturbation theory. Right? Here, the ingredients of the action are the information passing term and the propagation term. And the other way to do it is to use Monte Carlo methods just to do the high-dimensional integral directly. And in what I'm about to say, we've done both. The advantage of having an integral to do to give you the answers that you need means that you can specify the method and calculate the corrections. Almost all of what is known as statistical data assimilation, taking information from measurements, simply starts typically with the variational principle, which says look for a minimum of reaction, expand around that, and never no corrections for calculus. Any Monte Carlo methods we're familiar with physics quantum field theory. To approximate the action, in order to actually do something, here is a typical situation, not always true, but it is true in the cases that we talk about. If the measurements you make are independent of one another, and the distribution of the noise is Gaussian at every measurement, which is not outrageous, but isn't necessary, then the term, which is the information passing term, turns out to be just a measurement of the least squares distance between the state of the model and the measured quantity. So you can see this is like a potential which is active when the state of the model that you calculated is not near your measurements. And the other term, the transition probability from the state of time n to the state of time n plus 1, if there were no model errors and no noise, it's just a delta function. It's the core of nonlinear dynamics, deterministic nonlinear dynamics. But we have noise, and we have model errors, so we have to represent the delta function by broadening it in state space. There are many ways to do that. Doing it with an exponential version is perfectly fine. I can tell you that we've done various approximations with exponentials and other representations of delta functions, and it pretty much doesn't matter, except for the tails. All right. Now I'm going to talk about an example that shows how we actually use this. This is Mr. Lorenz's model from 1996. It has state variables called X. You get to choose how many of them. I'm going to show you calculations we did for dimension 5, dimension 20, and dimension 100. This quadratic term is supposed to imitate, but not accurately, fluid dynamics. This dissipative term is supposed to imitate, but not exactly, the dissipative term in the Navier-Stokes equation, and there's exactly one force. A lot is known about this. Let me just tell you that there's chaotic behavior when the forcing is a little bit bigger than some dimensionless number and physically meaningless number called 8. We use 8.17. You can check the orbits chaotic. You can check the fractal dimension. You can check all of the features. We want to ask a different set of questions. If we use these equations to generate data and then present the data to the model and ask when do we minimize the difference between the output of the model with 1 measurement, 2 measurements, 3 measurements, and so forth, how many measurements do we need in order to estimate the full state of the model and the parameter that we have there? And that turns out to be associated with the instability of this communications channel called synchronization. In this particular problem, we know that if you have d dimensions, d is 5 or 20 or whatever, you need 40%. So I'll show you many examples of the model with d equals 20, in which we know we need 8 measurements. And I'll show you an example of d equals 100, in which we know we need 40 measurements. But that means that we have to estimate the other 60 states accurately enough to predict, and that I'll show you. All right, I want to pass this, go back to the IFISC model, which I just said. And here's an example of using the full path interval to do the calculation. I'll go over the calculation. Lorentz 96 model has d equals 20. We determined by using sort of the usual stories about synchronization that we need 8 measurements. We added Gaussian noise to the measurements. Those are the blue, and this is the observation period called 4, some arbitrary units. So in this period, we make these observations. The black line is the correct noise-free calculation that we did in generating the data. The blue dot is the actual measurement, which you can see is noisy and varies around the correct answer. And the red error bars here are the error bars that we estimate in doing the estimation of the states and the parameters. When we get over to the end of the observation period, we've observed 8 quantities. This happens to be one of the observed quantities. And we have 12 unobserved states that we have to estimate by doing that path interval, and 1 parameter, and then we have to predict. And here are the predictions. You can see that going forward, we actually have rather good estimations. The error bars grow as they must in a chaotic system, and at some point we have to make more measurements. Yes, sir?
You say that to now you need 8 measurements. What do you mean? The dimension of the factor? What do you mean?
No.
How is this 8 calculated?
This is an extremely good and important question. Right? The dimension of the attractor in this case happens to be 12.5. The number of positively alpha enough exponents happens to be about 11. What we wanted to know is how many measurements we need to reconstruct the full attractor. That's about 2d plus 1, so let's say 25 or something like that. This is a different question. The question is, what is the stability of the information transfer channel due to perturbations around that channel? And we have to do those perturbations, say, in doing the Monte Carlo calculation for the integral. What you do is you take a guess of a state of the system, you perturb it, to map out as best you can the probability distribution, which I call the Monte section. This says you need 8 measurements in that action, which is composed of a measurement term plus a dynamics term, in order to get accurate efficiency.
Is this 8 something? So it's 8, not 8.5? Or is just empirically you see that you need 8?
What we did is we took the differential equations and we presented it one measure by coupling it into the differential equations and showed that the estimates were bad and that the model output did not synchronize with the observation. We took 2, and we took 3. And for d equals 20, at 8, synchronized when we got to the predictions. Okay? And then we did it for 40, and then we did it for 100, and then we plotted the number of measurements needed versus dimension, and it's approximately 0.4. Okay? And it's integer because we're dealing with, don't make half a measure. Sometimes you do, but you don't want to make half a measure. Yes, sir?
Will this number of 40% not also depend strongly on which dimension you actually have access to? I mean, flow stability, which is not necessarily the same in all dimensions.
Yes, and that's directly connected with my statement about the amount of information that's passed by the measurement. So I'm telling you the minimum. If you choose the wrong set of measurements to make, sometimes you need 0.5.
So now if you start with the system, you don't know yet, especially the connection between different dimensions. How would you then be able to say you need 40% of the dimensions?
That's an estimate for this problem, in this problem only. it's a combinatorial problem and it's a complicated calculation, therefore, suppose I have d equals 20 and I know I want to make 4 measurements. Which 4? There's some symmetries in the problem, otherwise it'd be 20 choose 4 calculations I need to make. But the symmetries don't reduce the number of calculations very much. So we did all of those calculations by brute force with this problem. It's so simple, it came up with the box. If there's a more brilliant way to do it, I'd love to know. I don't know. Yes, sir.
At some point you said that is that simulated by the model? So you basically calculate what is the correct parameter for the model, or
we calculate the correct parameter and the value of the unobserved 12 state variables at that value.
So how do you make the data simulation? You force the model with the data, or what was the procedure that you used to do?
Suppose we measured x1 only, and we saved that and called it y1. Can you see that on the screen? You have to have some way of transferring information about the model, about the data to the model. There are many ways to do that. We use a way which is extremely simple. The equation of motion for x1 is some function here of the x's, and we simply added a factor like this.
You derive the model with the measure.
That's right. And that's exactly right. I prefer to say that what we do is we couple information about the measurements into the model. But we don't for x2 or all the way up to x20 in this case. Those are now the same. And then we ask, under this circumstance, as a function of the strength of this coupling, what is the value of y1 minus x1 squared summed over time? That's the synchronization error between x1 and y1. And the answer is, for d equals 20, if you only tell it about number 1, this number never goes to 0. Okay. So then we said, how about if we add in number 3? And then we ask the same question, but we add here y3 minus x3. And that's why my answer to your question there is that this is a combinatorial problem. How did I choose 1 and 3? Well, I had to start somewhere, and I just calculated everything. It sounds very unimaginative, but, well, it is. Okay, but it worked. All right, and we found that until we added 8 pieces of information here, the synchronization error didn't go to 0. And then we came back and we checked that the conditional Lyapunov exponents defined by Pecora and Carroll in their 1990 paper on this subject, the conditional Lyapunov exponents were positive until we added 8 pieces of information, and they all became negative, which means the synchronization manifold became stable. We did that for d equals 20, we did that for d equals 5, we did this for d equals 100. Frankly, at that point, we were bored. Okay. All right. But we have now this rule of thumb. So, if we can turn the lights on again, thank you. So those are very important questions in how we actually do this. The next picture is for d equals 20. This is a variable that was not observed. And therefore we don't have any blue dots because we didn't observe it. But since we know the true answer, we can tell you what the estimate was of the variable in the observation period and the prediction. That means that this value at time 4, the end of observations, must have been very accurate. And the critical thing for us is the quality of the prediction. We know that eventually, in time, since our predictions are not infinitely accurate, the positively up-and-up exponent of this system will make the estimate, which is the green line, deviate from the black line. And it does so with the proper positively up-and-up exponent. So we don't expect perfect prediction. We hope for really good prediction over the prediction horizon for typical nonlinear systems. We estimated the parameter. This is the probability distribution of the parameter. When you use the Monte Carlo calculation, you really do this in statistical physics. You don't get just a single number for the parameter of the state. The probability distribution, you can see that we knew that the correct answer was here. Probability distribution for the calculation is this. It's not exactly Gaussian, but nobody can do it. We did it for d equals 100. We did it for d equals 100 because we submitted this paper to the quarterly journal of the Royal Meteorological Society with calculations for d equals 20. The referee said all real meteorologists use d equals 40. Right? Well, that was news to us, but since we weren't real meteorologists, we didn't think that the implication that we were wimps would apply. So we just wrote back saying we've done it for d equals 100, would that be okay? Great. That's sort of sociological, but what's perhaps more important is that the calculations which were done here on a very high dimensional system. So we have, I think this was a system of about 5,000, an interval of about 5,000 dimensions. Not really all that big. Some of the ones we've done are much, much bigger than that. It shows that with those techniques, you can estimate the parameters of states and still do And I would like, let me just say that when we did these Monte Carlo calculations, we eventually realized that instead of doing it on the CPU of a machine like this, if we did it on the GPU of a machine like this, since doing Monte Carlo calculations, doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, you have a guessed vector in the space, and you perturb it in an unbiased way, and then you choose to accept it or not accept it. Right, what's basically the problem's Hastings criteria. But that could be done in parallel on the GPU, and our earmark, our milestone on this is that in year N we buy the $200 GPU that NVIDIA produces. 2 years ago, that got us 300 times the speed of the calculation. Last year, it got us 500 times. This year, it's 1,500 times, and we're cheering for NVIDIA stock. They don't produce these things for us. They produce it for gamers. But for $200, you can take out the old one, throw it away, put it in the new one, and get yourself faster calculations. What that means is that you can really envision doing larger and larger problems in this way without getting scared. Okay, I want to go back to neurobiological systems, and I want to talk about what happens when you don't have enough measurements. And I'll tell you our ideas, and then you can tell me your ideas. And I much prefer yours probably, but I'll tell you all of them. All right, I've talked about the neurobiological experiments. Here's neurobiology in a single equation. I gathered that Claudia will teach a longer course of this in the early part of next year. But this is basically current conservation. This is a physicist's cell, perfect sphere. This membrane has the capacitance. It has proteins that stick through it that allow currents of ions, sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions, and chlorine ions, that are the physical things that go through. And the important thing is that C dV dt equals the currents plus the applied current plus, as it happens, if this neuron will connect with other neurons, there are currents that are induced by the action of other neurons through their axons that come to synapses that stimulate neurons. That's how the network really works. This is an isolated neuron that is not connected. What you have in this is conservation of current, and this is 1 over a resistance, conductance. You have conductances that depend on voltage, and there are kinetic equations written down in the 30s, 40s, and 50s by Hodgson and collaborators that give you an idea of what the structure of this should be. This is absolutely standard neurobiology stuff. We're using it in a very absolutely non-standard way by, let me go back. I don't want to talk about the numerical experiments, I want to talk about lab experiments. So this is another example of our lab experiment. This is 6,400 milliseconds, 6.5 seconds of data. This is the voltage response to this current. And I've explained the physical way in which we design the current. There may be a very clever mathematical way to say what current would give you the best estimates of the parameters you're interested in. But I'm going to leave that to you to solve. It's an interesting way to turn the problem around. And you can use the path intervals for representation of the answer to do just design experiments. This was our data. With this data, and the hundreds of other examples we have, I'm not going to show you them all, I invite you to make a biophysical model of the neuron that we selected, built up on biophysical principles of sleep, and make me a model of the neuron which is being stimulated by this red current to give me the results. In our numerical calculations, before we touch data, it's frankly nervous about failing too often. We found the following to be true. It seems obvious in retrospect. Amazing. If I have a neuron with 5 currents, and I present this neuron model, and I presented data with one of those currents missing, what's missing is the conductance of the current that's not there. And therefore, if I do an estimation of all the parameters in my neuron model with more currents than data, I should get some zeros. Because after all, this conductance is just a parameter in the model. So we did that both numerically and showed, here's the example of what we showed. This is a neuron with sodium, potassium, and biologists have a nice name for the fudge factor, about which they are called leak current. And we presented that data to a model with an extra current, and we found that the current maximum conductance, which should have been 0, was 10 to the minus 9. We declared that victory. That means that if you build a big model, many different currents on your experimental neuron, the data will prune out the parts of the model that are not needed and give you the reduced model that you need. And that turns out to work. Not only in these numerical experiments. So, here's the data again. So let me be precise about what we did. We took 1,500 milliseconds. The reason we chose 1,500 milliseconds is that there are several currents in the model that we chose that have time constants of 200 to 300 milliseconds. That's just known properties. So we thought, oh well, we better get 3 or 4 oscillations of that. You can think of that as a hand waving on your physicist's microscope. And then we'll get a good estimation, and we also did it many times, and then we'll predict the rest. So that's what we did. We took 1,500 milliseconds of this data. We estimated the parameters and states of the model that we had. And this is the voltage in black, the data that was measured, and in red was our estimation of the voltage during the measurement. It's not perfect. There are biophysical reasons having to do with how spikes are generated in these models that account qualitatively for that. And then from 1,500 milliseconds forward, we had to estimate all of the state variables which have to do with the permeability of the cell membrane the sodium ions, the potassium ions, and everything else that we don't know, all the parameters. We had to estimate all of those, and that was our prediction. So we estimated the first 1500 milliseconds and predicted with the remaining 4 seconds.
That's the complexity running prediction. Not point by point, this is stopping.
We start
1500 and then
we stop here, take the values of the state variables, fix all the parameters. State variables are the initial condition, and we integrate them. And I'm going to blow this up because this looks too good. Just to show you that it's indeed in some of the spike magnitudes and occasionally spike timing that the errors are made. There's a biophysical reason for that. I won't labor it. If you're interested, ask me.
So the forcing test, the forcing current is exactly the same. Is the original one.
Yes. We know the forcing of the system. Okay. Turns out we don't have to know that. We can estimate that too. It turns out we can estimate that too. The way you think about that is the forcing of the system is a current that you give me. It doesn't have dynamic force. It's a set of parameters that says, in this equation, put this number at this time. You can then introduce those as parameters to be estimated, and that works too. But I didn't want to talk about that because typically you know how you force the system. All right, that's one example. Here's another example, and this example is a different neuron. By the way, the experimentalists hid from us which neurons these were. The neurons were known to us by the year in which the measurement was made, the month, the day, and the first measurement was recorded. That's all we did. We secretly know a little bit more, but we didn't use that information. You can see that this is quite a different current profile, quite a different response profile. And epoch 11 means the following. We can make measurements on any individual neuron for a couple hours before the neuron dies. And what we do is we present a current to the neuron for 2 to 6 seconds. Turn off the current. Choose a different current, present that current for another 2 to 6 seconds, turn off the current. And we gather 50 or 60 different samples of that for each neuron. We call them epochs. This is epoch 11. What I'm going to do is show you both the prediction within this epoch and the use of the model with different forcing, different initial conditions to predict the next epoch. So, once again, I put them together this time. This is the estimation during the 1500 milliseconds, and this is the prediction after we stop making the measurements. We know the current that we're injecting. We have to estimate the state of this system here and all the parameters, which are fixed numbers, and then flow. This is the next epoch for the same neuron. If you look carefully, you can see that this is a different current. It happens to have a slightly smaller magnitude, a different waveform. This is the response. We now take the model from the previous epoch. And if you look really carefully, you can see a little red piece here. Because we don't know the initial state of the neuron, we have to estimate it. Parameters are all fixed. So we used 100 milliseconds of this 5,000 milliseconds to estimate the state of the system. Then we used the model from the previous epoch, and this is total prediction from that. So we're very confident, and by the way, we had, I don't know, about 50 or 60 different epochs, different current protocols for about 50 different neurons, and the quality of the predictions that I'm showing you occurred in about 85%. So, it's not perfect, it's biology, but we've learned that we can make a biophysical model, a biophysical system, and establish in an experiment that it gives good predictions. And in doing so, we use the statistical physics strategy that I want to talk about one more thing. I'll talk about it briefly, partly because of the hour, but mostly because I don't have much to say. Okay. What happens if I give you the Lorentz 96 model, they're more complicated. And I don't have 8 measurements, but I only have 1. And I use these twin experiments, in which I generate the data and ask, when does synchronization error go to 0, when does synchronization manifold stay? What happens? Well, our idea was that just as in other parts of nonlinear dynamics, you could learn aspects of the dynamics of the system by looking not only at the values at a given time, but at the waveform of the measurement, and looking at the values at time delays, you can get more information out of the experiment. So what we did in the case of the Lorentz 96 model with equals 20, where we know we need 8 measurements, is we said, suppose we change variables to a state space which is made out of time. We're not interested in reconstructing the entire state space. We're only interested in stabilizing this unstable communications channel. How many measurements do we need? How many time delays do we need in order to stabilize that measurement? That is a different question from reconstructing the entire phase space. And I will just say here, this is the logarithm of the synchronization error for d equals 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. For 5, 6, 7, and approximately 8, it goes to some number which is, I'll call it 1. And as soon as you have enough measurements, the synchronization error goes effectively to 0. So what we did is we measured one variable, made vectors out of the time delays of that variable, and then used that as our data. So here's in dimension 7, this is variable number 9. It's unobserved because we only observed the first variable. You can see that the estimations are not good and the prediction is terrible. At d equals 10, it's true for 9 also, here's another variable. It's unobserved. The estimations are very good and the predictions are good up until the horizon of instability due to the positive malfunction. We also estimated the parameter. The parameter is estimated very badly. The embedding dimensions are small and extremely well in the embedding dimensions. This doesn't solve the problem of numerical limit prediction yet. In order to do that, you have a little bit of work to do. You have to take the model from the European Center, your favorite model, which has 5 times that of the nitrogen, smaller. You have to study the nonlinear dynamical properties of that model, respecting the instabilities associated with transferring information from observations. And then you have to construct enough time delay vectors for the measurements you are allowed to make in order to stabilize the transfer of information from the data model. Most of what's going on in both brain science or nonlinear dynamics, functional biological systems, and meteorology has been to increase resolution for the last 30 years. Bigger computers, smaller distances between grid points. The European Center model of Britain now has 5-kilometer grids. The rest of Europe is about 10. Those are really remarkably small grid spaces. That's what gives rise to remarkably large universes. How many time delays you will need depend on the dynamics of those models, and I don't know that. But the fact that you can use time delays, information in waveform, augment the measurements you can do, consider extremely, should make you very optimistic. And it makes me optimistic, much more optimistic about the brain than it does about the weather. But I can't tell you exactly why. It's also
questions or comments?
So theoretically, do you think it might be possible to further reduce the number of minimal degrees of freedom, like 8 or 20 polynomials equal, by applying, for instance, coordinate transformation? Assuming, for instance, 2 degrees of freedom might be unnecessary, you have a direction in which you need a block.
It's always possible, and if you try to do it in nonlinear systems, it often involves luck. Namely, you make your choice. So I absolutely can't deny that that's a good thing to do. I'm sorry to do someday. I think that's a very good thing. I don't know a guiding general principle that would lead you to do this transformation or that transformation.
I mean, you have already a lot to do with the combinations that are given to degrees of freedom.
That's right. I don't deny there's lots of combinatorial stuff here too, but I know what I'm after. I know I'm after. Look, if I have a problem and I estimate I need 80 measurements, and in fact I need 79, I'm happy. Okay. Or I need 81 instead of 80, I'm still happy. But if I get the transformation wrong, I don't know exactly where it goes. The other reason why I'm very happy with the idea of using time delays is that it's already known for years of experience, a couple decades of experience in nonlinear dynamics, that there's additional information in the waveform beyond the coefficients. And we know systematically how to build that. We know some limitations, some things with delays, time delays too big, you lose the coherence because behavior. So why not build on that as a systematic way? And if that works, be very happy. And then add to it clever changes of variables. I'm all for it, but I don't know how to do it systematically.
When the model or the system has many different time scales, and they are from fast and slow variables, can you just measure, say, the slow ones, maybe the ones that are really observable, or do you really need to observe also the fast ones in order to get this working? Because this will pose a sort of problem.
Of course, no, it's a really good physics question, as opposed to just arithmetic stuff. And the truth is, I don't know. But intuitively, I agree with what you're suggesting. Suppose, and we've built some models for neurons because we know that there are other currents in the neurons that are stuck in rhythm, in which there's slow variables. They have calcium dynamics versus the voltage spike. My guess is that if you measure only slow variables, you will, in effect, be averaging out the spiking. And so then what you need to do is measure the fast variables with time delays that cover through the adding of dimensions to your time delay vector enough to capture the slow variation. That's a guess. And so I don't have a theorem for that, but I think intuitively you can see that if you measure only the slow variables, you average out the slots. So that's the best answer I can give you. And it's not even a good one, I'm sorry.
When you construct the propagator for this particular thing, the exponent has for each part which comes from the measurements has a quadratic term, and the coefficient is essentially the inverse of the variance of the measurement. Then you have written on the blackboard some dynamical systems in which the data is included as a linear term with a constant k. What those things? So in one case, the propagator of this thing will have k, not any noise L. What do you actually use?
Okay. Well, there are two different things that we. Oh, I see it. It's actually impossible to see it. Well, no wonder there's a question. What appears in the action is effectively this quantity. And you're right, there are coefficients here which have to do with the variance in each measurement. Okay? What appears here is a way of transmitting information from the known measurements back into the equation. As k goes to infinity, this drives your x1 to y1 as 1 over k, approximately. What we do in practice, and I didn't really discuss that, is we let k be a function of time, because the quality, the strength of the instability as you move along the orbit through the attractor varies, because the Lyapunov exponents, which are the indicators of instability, aren't constant across the attractor. They're quite inhomogeneous. So in some regions, K has to be big, and in some other regions, K can be 0. And then we add to this in the action we add a penalty for the cost of introducing this. And what we find, calculationally, is that K varies across the attractor in exactly the way you'd expect. Where the error in the measurement is small, K can be small. When the error in the measurement is big, K can be as much as an order of magnitude or so bigger. But as the model reaches equality with the observations, this term becomes effectively completely insignificant. And the minimization procedure you're using is minimizing K squared. And when you're done, you have X approximately Y, which was your goal, and K approximately round off error in the computer to 0. That's what we do in practice. But I thought explaining that in the middle of all this.
That's what's intended.
So if you could think this a bit the other way around, for example, if you look in weather forecasting with the if complex model, and yet many parameters in this model are not known, and the processes aren't either. So if you start to take to increase the amount of data points you have, you get a convergence for your prediction. Could you now, but all assuming an imperfect model. So could you use the convergence behavior, for example, to check the model validity, or actually some good mechanisms are still missing?
This is a question I absolutely have no answer for. But I'm going to tell you what I think, okay? Because I believe that it's an important question to give physical thought to. If I tell you I have equations of motion and they're embedded in a noisy environment, you might say, everything's F equals MA. So MA equals F plus fluctuations, right? Tell me the magnitude of the fluctuations, KT, if that's what it is, tell me the something. So that's a way of representing, and if that's the case, and those fluctuations are Gaussian, you more or less get to the way that I represented the statistics of the transition probability. But what if, as you suggest, I actually have errors in my model because I forgot the term? I wrote MA equals F, but I forgot F prime. How do I give a quantitative way to determine that forcing is absent without trying to put it in and seeing what the effect is? So I don't know the answer. I can deal with statistical, environmental background fluctuations today. We all do. I'm not inventing that. I like to think of this technique as not replacing the thought you have to give as a physicist to make models. I would be horrified if I gave you a crank to replace everybody in the room, except the ones who ran upstairs taking the 930s. I think of it as a way of testing the environment to test consistency of the model that you use, the data that you're providing, the number of measurements that you're provided, and the frequency, how often you make the measurements. And the only metric that I know of for testing the model that you made under those circumstances are the prediction errors. Your prediction and the error margin. If those are consistently bad, you are unable to estimate the state of the system, even though in a meteorological case you don't know it in detail. You only know it because of the picture. It's time to go back to the totally satisfactory answer for deployment physicists. Totally unhappy answer for understanding physics.
thanks again. Maybe I think about